Right, hello, greetings, hello. It's Dr. Thomas Daffern here for my philosophy club, which I haven't done for a couple of weeks. I've been very busy, but I thought I'd check in now because we're coming up to Samhain, Halloween. It's the end of the Celtic year and there's a lot to chew on. A lot of world events have been going on, and I want to, start with that really, reflections at the end of the year. This year has been, personally a very tragic year. I'd say one of the worst years I've known for a long time, if ever, involving the death of my beloved daughter, Sophia, taken from us at the age of 38, completely unexpectedly and pointlessly. On a global scale, it's been a year of mass killing and genocide in Gaza, unrest and chaos in the West Bank and many other parts of the Middle East with bombings and so on. And also ongoing conflict in Ukraine and Russia. We're facing a kind of moral meltdown of humanity. I've coined this phrase, moral entropy. It appears to me that human beings have a sort of default to ignorance and evil sometimes. I used to think when I was growing up that we had a default towards goodness, righteousness and wisdom. I'd like to hope that's still the case. But it seems that, there are forces, there are people, there are individuals, there are mechanisms that lead to moral entropy. So we have to fight against that. We have to stand for moral goodness and the elevation of humanity, as my friend Sachin Raja says. We need a World Elevation Forum to elevate humanity to our proper stature. And that's what I've been doing with the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum as well, so we're going to collaborate on that. So it's been a difficult year for many people. I'm sure many people have been suffering, not least at watching these tragic events and knowing people that they've affected. So let's just start with that tragedy, really. It's not just the death of my daughter Sophia, it's the death of so many other innocents that we have to mourn now. And we're coming up to Samhain, which is when the spiritual world and the human physical world interweave. So a couple of minutes silence maybe for this would be appropriate to start with. So I want to start by saying that I've just been on a trip back to the UK. I go back and forth, and I've been in the UK for a few weeks, visiting some of my favourite places in Sussex, discovering Shoreham, which is a beautiful little town with a wonderful church, ancient church in the middle, Mary Le Havre, exploring Worthing again, and enjoying being in Sussex, also spending time in Brighton and Saltine, seeing friends. But of course the whole thing is a bit bleak given my daughter's not there. She ought to be there, and she was supposed to come back with me, but she can only come back in spirit. I also, on this trip, went to Winchester, which is one of my favourite cities in Britain. The cathedral there was Alfred the Great's watering hole, and exploring the bookshops and cafes and so on of Winchester. It's always a fun. It's where my daughter taught for, my other daughter, Shanti Grace, taught there for a while at Winchester College, which is one of the oldest schools in Britain. And I went to Wiltshire and spent time there talking to Druids about Stonehenge and Avebury and all kinds of things. And then down to Glastonbury, which is another town I love in Somerset, and visiting the White Spring, which is like a beautiful temple to the goddess. And if you're in Glastonbury, do go and visit. And yeah, that was wonderful. Also in Sussex, exploring Cuckmere Haven, which is a beauty spot where the river goes down. Discovering Hove, so I've been enjoying my trip to Britain. And also I went to London, up to Westminster, to Parliament, where I organised 35 meetings in the past on peace and ethics and interfaith matters. And it was fun to be invited to a Jain conference organised by the Indian Jain community in Britain to honour my dear friend Dr S.L. Gandhi, who I've known for 30 years, who received the International Ahimsa Award from the Institute of Jainology. So well done, Dr. Gandhi. Well deserved. And some wonderful people were there who I met. Professors at Birmingham University, where they're doing intensive Jain studies. And it was nice to be back in Parliament, to be honest, because it's a place I know well. And a friend of mine once nominated me for the House of Lords, which would be fun. I didn't get it. I'm not convinced the House of Lords should remain in its current format. I'll come on to that a bit later. I think it should be probably an elected body representing the regions. And there should be more faith communities represented, not just Anglican Christians, but others. That's what I would do with the Lords. And I've written a paper proposing that. Then I also took part just recently in a conference run from London by my old friend Vijay on his project called Uniting for Peace. It's a network that he runs. I've spoken before at their events. They're always fascinating. He brings together really interesting people, and we were discussing, what can we do, uniting for peace across the different peace groups, the different interest groups, the different intellectuals that are working for peace. Vijay Mehta chaired this event, and we heard from a variety of speakers. I was one of them. And really we were addressing this problem of the world is on fire, effectively. How can we break the cycle of endless wars that are going on? We don't want just a ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. We want an actual peace treaty, lasting, permanent. How can we do that? How can we put the fire out that keeps breaking out in the peat, as my old friend Adam Curl used to describe it? So I spoke about my work as a philosopher and historian, and my work trying to sketch out a kind of landscape in which peace can become possible. I mentioned my proposal for a European peace agency, modelled on the European Space Agency, which is up and running. It's a big thing. It has a budget of billions. It does very advanced space research like NASA does in the States. Well, I think peace is as important as outer space research, because if we don't get peace on this planet and we blow it up through accidental nuclear war or, death by 1,000 little wars, there's nobody going to be left to explore outer space. It will just be like a smoking hulk flowing through the ethers. So no, we've got to invest as much into the search for peace as we are doing into outer space research. So a European peace agency modelled on the European Space Agency is, I think, a good idea, and I shared it at this conference and people were interested. And I mean, it would have the same budget. I suggest we model it on their budget, which is several billion. The interesting thing about the European Space Agency is it includes the UK and all the EU countries, and it's headquartered in Paris. The French have always loved their astronomy, and they're very good at it, and their mathematics, and so I think we need a European peace agency. I don't care where it's located, which capital city, but it needs to have a budget that can actually focus on mediation, conflict resolution, proper peace diplomacy. And I think it should be independent of the European Union. I've come to the view of that, because the European Union it wasn't intended to be a political project, except a peace project, but it's become too politicised. And I think if it was an independent body, the European Peace Agency, including the UK, then that would be for the best, I think, for the time being. So I spoke about that and many other things. I talked about the Middle East peace work I'm doing. and I'll mention some of these matters later on in this talk. So that was a good thing, meeting some fascinating people and hearing their talks and discussions by Rivera's son on non-violence, the work she's doing from the States. And then I've also been reading a book. I want to share some of my current studies. This is a historical study that I've never read before in detail, called A Distant Mirror, by Barbara Tuchman, who's a great historian. She's dead now, sadly. And she's an absolute genius. Yes, I recommend this book. What it does is it studies relations between, well, the 14th century. Its subtitle is The Calamitous 14th Century, from 1300 to 1400. And she makes the point that that was one of the worst epochs in human history. She's writing in the 20th century and saying, look, you know, things are pretty bad in the 20th century. We've had 2 world wars. Old faiths have broken down and been replaced by angst, and we don't know what's going on. So, but if we go back to the 14th century, it was pretty similar. There was an absolute crisis of confidence in European affairs, and it was the time of the Black Death, which killed about a third of the population of Europe, all the way from the Balkans right the way up to Iceland. Millions of people died, cruelly and horribly. And the thing is, their medicine wasn't good enough. They didn't know what was causing it. They thought, therefore, it was some sort of plague sent by God. They interpreted it in apocalyptic terms. And you got bands of penitents wandering around Europe, semi-clothed, beating their backs with chained whips, so that they bled, thinking that if they punished themselves, it would take away God's wrath. It was a horrendous time. And then it was also the time of the 100 Years' War. So what did France and England do during this time? They engaged in 100 years of war fighting, with intermittent truces, but they never lasted. And huge set battles like Poitiers and Crécy and so on. And the book covers all this. It's absolutely fascinating. And, you know, this is one of the reasons why I'm so in favour of the European Union and peace, because that 100 Years' War was horrendous. The amount of killing and death it caused, the kind of social breakdown that it precipitated, what I hadn't realised before reading this book, because she goes into the detailed effects on French history of the 100 Years' War. After the Battle of Poitiers, the English captured the French king, Jean, took him off to England, and he was held in house arrest, I think in Oxford, for nearly 10 years, actually, because the French couldn't raise a huge ransom for him. During that time, moral authority, legal authority broke down in France. It was a feudal society. It all depended on having a king. And there wasn't one. There was a king in absentia in Oxford. And people just stopped following the laws. And it grew to the point where there were bands of disaffected knights and peasants teamed up and were ravaging the countryside, ransacking villages, stealing what they could, killing, raping, setting on fire, just acting like rogue guerrilla bandits against their own people. So these are largely French armed bands who are now wandering around France. There's no one to fight, so they're fighting their own people. A complete breakdown of moral order, and this was a thing that went on for a decade or so. Absolutely horrendous. It's described in the book. They were called routiers, highwaymen, and in Italy, condottieri, because the same thing started happening in Italy. And even in Britain, there were armed gangs wandering about, just raping and killing. One learns about the Black Prince, who I was taught was a war hero and a great man. Actually, he was a war criminal who massacred the population of Limoges, which is very close to my centre here, and under absolute cruelty. A war criminal. I think his own conscience kicked in, because then he got very ill, and he was an invalid for the rest of his life and finally died not long after. The book is based around Sire de Coucy, who was a nobleman in France from Picardy, and he was a friend of all kinds of people on both the English and the French side. And he actually married the daughter of King Edward III, who was the King of England, Isabel. And so he saw life both in England and in France. And the 100 Years' War really upset him because he didn't want there to be a war. He didn't know which side to take. He declared neutrality at one point. But finally, when the chips are down, he was ultimately French, and he rejoined the French side, and his wife stayed in England. So it's a fascinating study, and it's an example of why history is so important. I think that people need to study history in order to learn not to repeat these mistakes. I think the trouble with the cavalier politicians we've got around at the moment is a lot of them have no clue. I mean, I don't think people like Trump or Farage or all that crew have the slightest clue about history. They're anti-intellectuals. Even Putin has an extremely selective and disjointed and distorted view of Russian history, let alone world history. They haven't got the breadth of mind or intellect to see why history matters to peace. And in my view, in the European Peace Agency, we would have a Department of Historical Studies trying to make the case for peace based on historical precedents. Because when we lose history, we lose sight of it, ignore it, we make tragic mistakes, and we precipitate into violent conflict. The other thing I'd like to share, another book I've been reading, is a fantastic biography of Desmond Tutu called Rabble Rouser for Peace, who is one of my heroes. He was a Christian protege of Trevor Huddleston, who I met at the London School of Economics when I was a student there. He came and gave some talks. And he founded, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for South Africa, which I used as a model for my Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, and also the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. So Tutu, I never met him personally, but I know people that did, and he was a great man, really. And this book by John Allen is the authorised biography going into his background, his life story. His father was a teacher, interestingly enough, in South Africa. And yes, they were not a rich family, they were a poor family. A teacher's salary was not great. He often didn't have enough money to buy kids shoes, but they valued education, they valued learning. And he rose through the ranks of the church and became a great, Anglican Christian leader. And so I'm studying and learning about his work, which is absolutely fascinating. I'm also studying, and this is something I found actually in Winchester, in a wonderful bookshop in Winchester, Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack. And as a philosopher, you see, I get really cross when people try and destroy knowledge and distort it or pollute it or corrupt it or threaten it. And I believe in academic freedom. That's the point of the Philosophy Club, is to fly the flag for reason, for rationality, for science, for scholarship, for the humanities. And I think I found a kindred spirit in Richard Ovenden, who's the head of the Bodleian Library. Now, when I taught at the University of Oxford, I used the Bodleian. It's like a mecca to me. And I love this guy who is conscious of his duties as a librarian, and he's singing the praise of libraries around the world, which are often attacked in wartime, and books are burned, and he's describing how this has happened in history and why. It's a fascinating study, Burning the Books by Richard Ovenden, and I'm just, he goes right back to ancient Mesopotamia, where writing really began, and Egypt. And it's fascinating. I don't believe in burning books. I believe in reading them, studying them, and respecting them, and learning from them. And that's why I'm a teacher and a philosopher. And long may it last. Thank you, Richard, for that marvellous study. And another book in my spare time. I've taken on a big project. I'm studying the whole of the Golden Bough by Sir James Fraser. Now, this is a fascinating work. I've always had it on my desk to study, to read. I've had a copy. I've never sat down and read it before. And thanks to talking books, you can sit and listen to a 44-hour book, which is what it is, as you're doing other routine admin stuff, letters and things. And it is a feast of scholarship. He studied classics at Glasgow, and when I lived in the Castle of the Muses in Scotland, I lived near Helensburgh, one of my local towns, and he was born there. And I thought we ought to have a kind of memorial to him somewhere. He then he did an MA at Glasgow in classics, and then he went to Cambridge, and he did a thesis down there. And he became a professor of anthropology, but he was really a classicist, actually, and that's clear from the Golden Bough. He really, really knew his Greek and Latin sources. What he's going into in the book is really about power and whether human beings have always had, whether there's an ancient cult in human history that the king must die, whether rulers, kings in tribes around the world, and also in the classical world, expected to be killed. And they gave themselves willingly, knowing, well, I'll be king for 10 years, 15 years, but then I will die in a sort of sacrificial ritual. He's reconstructing something about the archaeological prehistory of human thought. The other thing that he's important for is his concept of magic. He analyses the nature of magic and its impact on human consciousness. He's arguing that we humans are magical creatures, that we are interested in similarities between things, that our very word forms, our thinking, our conceptual matrices are premised on this kind of what he calls the homeopathic magic of similitudes. And so that itself is another theme running through his book. Now, he believes that we need to grow out of this and that we need to advance towards science. But, I'm only halfway through the book. I'm still waiting to see how he's proposing for us to do that. What I do know is that his ideas influenced a lot of important other scholars in the the 20th century, including Robert Graves, the White Goddess, and also Margaret Murray, who was a professor of Egyptology and who wrote about, she argued that the sacrificial king cult survived on into the Middle Ages, and it influenced Gerald Gardner, who was one of the co-discoverers or inventors of Wicca, and helped shape some of the Wiccan rituals of neo-paganism, and who was also friends with some of the senior Druids of the day. So we know that the Druids would appoint the kings and also sack them in the Celtic world if they were wrong, if they did things that were immoral. I'm looking at the Trump phenomena in America, and I'm thinking this is a power-crazy guy who wants to be king. So 7 million people come out and march against him, saying no kings. What if we had ritual kings that were sacrificed every 10 years? Wouldn't it teach a bit more humility? I mean, it's a serious question to ask. And then, of course, Fraser argues that this was the point of Jesus. He was the sacrificial king who, of his own volition, accepted the deal, so to speak, in loving sacrifice towards the people. It's an interesting hypothesis. Also, what Fraser seems to be able to prove is that Attis, who was another of these dying and resurrecting gods, had a temple in the site of the Vatican. Interesting, I'm trying to find out the exact location and whether archaeologists have confirmed this, and what was Fraser's, sources on that. But it's certainly a feast of classical scholarship and thought and reflection. And although it's very out of fashion, nobody admits to reading Fraser anymore because he's supposedly, superseded. I think what the problem is with anthropology is that it's become obsessed with micro details. So you have a whole generation of anthropologists that came after Fraser who wouldn't dare to do what he did, which was try to synthesize masses and masses of data into an overall hypothesis. Nowadays you just study one little tribe, one little place for a few years, and you do your thesis and that's it, you stick with them. You don't join up what he did, which was like all the world's tribes and cultures and religions, and try and come to a general hypothesis about the nature of magic and the nature of political succession and kingship. But I think I'm old school. I agree with Fraser's attempt, even if he didn't succeed fully. And talking of which, so in my own attempt at a grand synthesis, as a philosopher, I've published recently on the logic of peace, which is an attempt to integrate some of my 30 years thinking about the nature of peace and how we can reshape what logic is. If we say we want a logical world system, well, what do we mean? If we want a peaceful world order, what do we mean? If we want a multilateral, rules-based world system, well, what would that be, logically speaking? Is it possible? Or are people too illogical? So I've grappled with all these questions in the book, and I've looked at logic according to the history of not just Western logic, Greek and Roman and European, but also Hindu logic, Jain logic, Buddhism, the history of Christianity and its attempts to grapple with logic, the history of Islam and logic, and Judaism. And it took a lot of research and thinking, this book, and it's just been published, and I recommend it to people if you're worried about the state of the world and why everyone seems to be getting crazier and crazier. Well, read my book on the logic of peace. It seems to me we need a logic of peace if we're going to avoid a logic of nuclear meltdown and catastrophic third world war. So the other thing I'm doing is, I want to just give a shout out to my friend Alexander Beauharnais, who's a descendant of Napoleon's wife, Josephine Beauharnais, and a great man. Alexander is a media personality and a actor, and he's been helping with the International Delphic Academy, which I chair, and he's just recently, sadly, taken ill and is in hospital in the US. So I send prayers for his health and recovery. We need him, dear Alexander, so please get well. And then I want to say a shout out for a conference I'll be helping with in December. This is a looking ahead on interfaith eschatology. This is a conference run by my friend Moeen Yassin. I'm helping him, who's a Muslim based in Turkey, although he's lived for many years in Scotland. And he's given a lot of thought to, the state of the world. Where are we going? What is the divine intelligence wanting for humanity? What do the prophetic traditions say? Can we reconcile them? Can we reconcile the Islamic Quran-based prophetic tradition? Can we reconcile that with Judaism, the Jewish prophets? Can we reconcile that with Christianity? These are very important questions. I believe we can have a prophetics of peace rather than a prophetics of war. If we, of course, we can read the prophetic traditions in the Middle East and say, well, it's all going to end in an Armageddon, and most people are going to die, and it's horrendous, but there's nothing you can do about it. Or, and I don't agree with that, but it's very common, I'm saying we can actually choose not to do that. We can reinvent the script, and we can have a prophetics of peace, because that's the ultimate goal of prophecy. That was what the great prophets of all the traditions actually wanted. The question is how we get there. Well, that's why I'm saying we need both a logic of peace, but also prophetics of peace to try and make that possible. So that's what I'll be talking about on the December the 14th conference. You're welcome to attend. Ask me for the details. And this fits in with my commitment to the Druid path. And we're coming up to Samhain, which is the Druid New Year. Because the Druids had their own prophets. They had their ovates, or vates, as they were called in Rome. And you had to train to be a Druid. It took 20 years of study. What were the how were the Druids trained, say in relation to the prophetic schools of the Semitic cultures like Israel or in the Islamic world? Those are important questions. What about in India, in the Hindu and other Indian religions? What's the equivalent of a prophet? Is a rishi the same as a prophet or different? And in what way are they different? These are all important questions which some of which we will talk about on December the 14th, but others will, in other fora. Is there such a thing as prophetic intelligence? Yes, I think there is. How do we train for it? How do we learn about it? Another important study I've been doing, and I want to share this, is this work, Compromised. I've mentioned this before by Peter Struzhok, who was the head of counterintelligence for the FBI for nearly 2 decades. And his job was to track down illegal foreign agents working on American soil who were attacking the US from within, especially Russian and Chinese agents who were the main threats. And basically it's a study of what he feels about the Trump era, Trump presidency. And he was part of it's subtitled Counterintelligence and the Threat of Donald J. Trump. Because what he's arguing is that yes, Trump shows is a threat to the national security of the US, and I think anyone that is familiar with geopolitics and world affairs would concur in that. But exactly what is the threat? Why? What's happening? I mean, it's incredible that Trump is now knocking down parts of the White House. I mean, it's a symbolic act of desecration and destruction. I think most decent Americans are turning in their graves and horrified at what Trump has been doing with ICE, with the dismantling, and now shutting down the government. The guy's an absolute maverick, and what's so important about Struzhok's work is he's explaining what he found out about Trump's background and why we should be worried about him. There's a very interesting quote, a couple of quotes that he starts his book with, which are worth sharing, from George Washington, one of them, because he was the first president, and he had this to say in his farewell address, 1796, "A free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government." So that was then, and Washington was really conscious. He'd just won the War of Independence against the British by the skin of his teeth. I mean, he could have lost it. And they embarked on this experiment of democracy, of a Republican government. They didn't want kings anymore. And most decent people around Europe and around the world supported this. They thought, okay, let them have a go. It would be tragic to see it come crashing down, in my opinion, with some maverick, crazy guy like Trump destroying it all. And so it's interesting Washington said that a free people ought to be constantly awake. Well, I agree with that. I would like to think I'm one of them. The problem is, what do you do when lying takes over in geopolitics? And it becomes corrosive, because only truth can sustain